Is the internet about to change forever? Could removing what are called net neutrality rules turn it into a place of the haves and the have-nots, where rich firms pay for their content to join fast lanes while the rest get left behind? Or will the consumer get more choice on a faster internet? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Now, Donald Trump and his team have recently overturned Obama-era rules on net neutrality, and that means internet providers can offer fast lanes where richer companies pay for the best connections to their consumers. The question is, does that mean that rich firms have an advantage over the new companies who can't afford to overtake and get in the fast lane? A fast internet for the rich and a slow one for the poor. It could happen now that Barack Obama-era laws to protect internet neutrality are being rolled back.
Today we wipe away this work, destroy this progress, and burn down time-tested values that have made our internet economy the envy of the world.
Without what's called net neutrality laws, internet providers have the power to pick and choose who can stream data on faster lanes online. So in the future, will they serve as the internet's paid gatekeepers? Under Trump's America, net neutrality is bad for business.
It is not the job of the government to be in the business of picking winners and losers in the internet economy.
Net neutrality opponents saying that Obama's laws were outdated and throttled innovation. Before laws were introduced in 2015, Facebook rose from humble origins in Mark Zuckerberg's dorm room to become the biggest social network of all. Less heavy-handed regulation could allow for more competition, cheaper, faster, better internet. Netflix accounts for more than 30% of streaming online in the US, so why shouldn't they pay more? Supporters say the US government is erasing equality on the web, an unregulated cyberspace giving providers the power to decide who gets the best services. In New Zealand, Vodafone has removed data caps from social apps such as Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, and Twitter. This preferential treatment could divide the internet into haves and have-nots, putting big players such as Google and Amazon at an advantage, exacerbating the power of monopolies. Already, nearly 2/3 of Americans live in areas with only one choice for high-speed internet. Who stands to gain the most from the death of net neutrality? Will the gap between the rich and poor begin to infect cyberspace? Or will an unregulated internet economy create greater consumer choice? The US is the hub of the World Wide Web. Whatever happens, we are all caught in the net. Well, I'm very pleased to say that at the round table we have Emily Taylor, an internet governance and privacy expert who is the editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. We have Mark Chapman, leader of the UK Pirate Party, a group that campaigns for internet freedom, among other things. We have Sam Dumitriu, head of research at the Adam Smith Institute, and we also welcome Ian Walden, head of the Institute of Computer and Communications Law at Queen Mary University of London. You all know a great deal more about this than I do, so I hope to be incredibly well informed by the end of this programme. But who wants to start up with the question, why does any of this matter? Emily.
It matters because the internet is there just primarily as a way of getting content around, getting people in touch with what they want to see or view online, and anything that interrupts that or puts obstacles in the path of the internet functioning properly is potentially risky.
See, I'm not even really sure that I understand why it would stop the internet functioning properly, because it would still be there, still be as good as it is now. It's just that I might have to pay different ways to get what I want.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well,
jump in.
I think that a big what we need to understand about this concept of net neutrality is it comes down to an understanding of what it is that the internet does and what it is that an internet service provider, an ISP, the person that you pay for your broadband connection, provides. And we tend to use lots of analogies when discussing this to try and simplify it, and none of them work brilliantly, but please forgive me for one here. The internet service provider basically provides data. It provides the pipe through which data, your internet information,
the information superhighway,
can come.
Yeah.
And as private party, as a party of freedom, and we believe that you should have free access, free as in free speech, not free as in free money, access to that information without the internet service provider being the person that tells you what you can and can't watch, or what you can and can't download. And if you think of it,
but they're not telling you that. They're just telling you there would be different ways of doing it.
Yeah, and I think it's a view of the internet which is a common misperception. And the internet is not one thing. It's a network of networks, and those networks are all private companies, and those private companies invest millions and billions of dollars in network, and they have a commercial right to make decisions about how that investment is realized.
I mean, isn't it a little bit like, here's my analogy, you can either buy a terrible old car that won't get out of the slow lane, or you can buy a nice one in which you can sit in the fast lane and you can get everything that you want to your destination more comfortably, more safely, etc., etc. But you've got to pay for that privilege, surely.
Yeah, and we have a system at the moment called universal service, just about paying for us to get connection just for voice telephony, let alone broadband internet access. So government does intervene in this market. It's just the level and the way in which it intervenes, and the danger that Emily pointed out, that too much regulation may kill the golden goose.
But extra investment, in other words, if a rich company gets lots of money from its customers, it's not necessarily going to want to sort of spite them by giving them a weaker service. It's going to make things better for them and thereby everybody in the end, perhaps.
I think the fundamental argument against strict net neutrality rules like were passed in 2015 in America.
These were the Obama ones that are now being repealed.
Yes, yeah. So is about investment. What will get the most investment in broadband, especially what will get the investment in rural areas dealing with underserved communities. And I think the argument in favour of getting rid of those rules is that the internet, ISPs operate in what's called a two-sided market. So on the one hand, they could get money from big companies like Netflix, Google, Amazon, and on the other hand, they could get money from ordinary subscribers. Kind of like how newspapers can get money from big advertisers, or they can get money from the people who buy the paper every day. Now you see different models working in different markets. So some markets it makes sense to have it completely free to the end user, but charge for advertising, as you see with newspapers. This is a similar case. So if you say that you can't charge the companies like Netflix, Google, Amazon anything for the way they use the pipes, then it means that the prices will have to be higher at the other end. This is what's called the waterbed effect. You press down on one end, like pressing down on a waterbed, it pops up at the other end. And that's the fundamental argument. So it will mean that net neutrality rules will mean higher prices for broadband subscribers.
Doesn't this work somewhere else or other countries at the moment? I'm thinking of Portugal, perhaps?
Different countries view net neutrality in different ways. In Europe, we tend to see it, or historically have seen it more as a consumer protection concern, or whereas in the United States it's more about a competition concern. So different countries view the problem in a different way, and therefore we've come up with different solutions.
And so in countries such as Portugal, is it a problem?
Overall in the European Union, there is a law, there's a directive about net neutrality and actually data roaming. So something that's come in quite recently, which means if you travel through the European Union, you can roam like at home. And that's part of the way that the European lawmakers have seen this as actually a consumer protection, but also a competition issue. It's sort of the classic sort of arguments line up on either side, which is about, well, internet service providers, they have congested networks, a bit like congested roadways. And actually, if you're doing something like watching a video or playing a multiplayer game, it really matters to you that all of those bits arrive at the same time. If you're receiving an email, not so much. So every provider does a bit of traffic management. But what the European system is saying is, look, you only do that in exceptional and temporary circumstances. You actually have to provide an even playing field. Why is this important? It's because any network favours the winner. If you're providing a free service, like a zero-rated service, you can have as much Facebook as you like, you can have as much Netflix as you like. They've already won in the market. What about the new innovative service that we don't yet imagine, we don't yet know? They will always be on the losing side of that equation. Yeah. And that's why advocates of net neutrality get very worked up about it.
Sorry, I was going to say that, I have no issue with internet service providers throttling, giving you a data cap. So you have to, if you get more data, if you want to receive more data, you have to pay more. It's exactly the same as a metered water connection, But what is wrong is for the internet service providers to tell you what you can and can't be using that data for, what services you can't. Well, that would be analogous to, your water provider saying, well, it'll cost you £15 a litre for drinking water and £30 a litre if you want a bath.
OK, let's see who comes up with the best analogy by the end of the programme.
So, well, I think what's sort of separate from this debate is that on the competition side is there's two ways of really dealing with a competition problem. Either you can ban a practice completely outright, or you can say, we'll ban this practice if it's being used in an anti-competitive way. So, for instance, bundling services together, that can be great for consumers. You get a PlayStation and you get 3 games at the same time. But it can also be bad if, for instance, someone has a monopoly power and they're using it to bundle with products that don't have a monopoly, and they can exercise their market power beyond that. And so I think net neutrality is an issue where you should treat it a bit like you treat bundling. It should be allowed sometimes for you to diverge, pay fast lanes, I think, could actually deliver faster connections and more investment. Okay, where that works, I think that's where it matters.
When you want it, you would pay for it, but other times you wouldn't have to.
Well, I think it's where the regulator should step in. So the way it's regulated in the US and in Europe is certain practices are banned outright, well, until the recent rule change in America at least. I don't think that's the most sensible way of doing it. I think it's better to rely on antitrust authorities to say, OK, this is being used in a bad way, so we're going to intervene. So you might say, OK, we think it's great if Netflix wants to pay for a fast lane and pay, tens of millions of pounds, and that's going to lead to more investment. We want to allow it in that case. But we might say, OK, so Comcast wants to favour its own TV channels over Netflix and is throttling Netflix and demanding them to pay a big fee. We don't think that's good. I think you can perfectly distinguish between those cases, and I think that's the kind of treatment that makes a lot more sense.
Well, what's the difference going back? We talked about them being Obama-era rules. So pre-2015, one assumes that there wasn't net neutrality, which he brought in 2015. So therefore, how is it working?
Yeah. So the rules in the United States are slightly peculiar. The point is, the regulator, the Federal Communications Commission, decided to treat broadband internet service providers as not equivalent to a traditional telephone company. So they were essentially removed from the standard regulatory framework. And all the FCC decided to do under Obama was to bring those categories of provider within the regulatory framework rather than leaving them outside.
So were there still rules when it wasn't treated as a...
Indeed.
And were these rules restrictive?
Well, there was a rule in 2010 which attempted to get to the position that the 2015 order had. And actually, throughout the history in the United States, it's been a sort of tussle between one and the other, hasn't it? The fundamental issue is that the United States, the access provider market is incredibly concentrated. You've also got a very challenging terrain and large terrain with large areas of mountains and deserts and sparsely populated areas, so it's difficult to make a profit. So it's difficult to get people investing, but over half of US households don't have a choice of broadband provider. And so to your point about antitrust being the way to go, to a certain extent,
antitrust is anti-competition.
It is. It's sort of to stop abuse of competition. Yeah. You've already got a very high-risk environment, particularly as telephone companies who still are the primary access providers, are searching for new revenues. They don't want to be digging holes in the roads. They want to be up there with Netflix and Facebook making lots of money. And so what they're doing is trying to diversify into applications. And what better when you own the network than to just nudge along your product in favour of that and downgrade everybody else's.
Well, what are the chances of this being overturned? The Democrats, I know, want to do this, and they're trying to get that in Congress. They don't have a majority, so it sounds unlikely. But in terms of a groundswell,
I think it's likely to get through, because essentially it's saying no, go back to no change. I mean, the system has always been no net neutrality rules. They were introduced, they were never fully implemented, and essentially they'll be removed. So we won't actually see a very significant change in the United States in that respect. I think the problem is, you know, the whole telecoms market over the past 30 years has been one of ever greater competition. And then we've ended up with an environment which we call the internet, which we're starting to say, well, that sounds like a public utility. And we have this competing view of the internet as a public utility, which is more akin to electricity, gas, power, or whether it's actually a fully vibrant, competitive market. And I think the answer has to be, it depends.
how will I notice the difference? How will you notice the difference? Not in terms of what you're advocating or pushing for, but if you're sitting at home, who wants to kick off on that one?
Well, if you're with a particular service provider that is connected, has a license agreement with Disney, then you might be able to watch certain films, and watching other films will be harder because they will throttle that, or they'll say you have to pay more. So as a user, that restricts your choice if you don't have access to the full range of what the internet can provide.
So what I say is, I don't like what you're giving me. I'm going to go to the other one down the road. I'm going to go to the next
internet. And in the US, you can't do that.
There has to be another one.
And it is as difficult as that.
Apparently
That's what
so.
you were just saying about remote
also,
areas.
I think the other aspect is that people might not necessarily be aware of what's going on. They just experience a degraded service. During the last big net neutrality debate in the United States, a lot of the content companies like Netflix would put a sort of spinny on for their customers to say, this is Verizon throttling your traffic. And actually,
You mean the dreaded wheel, as I call it?
Yes, you asked about groundswell, and one of the things that really amazes me is the level of public interest and public passion about net neutrality. The Federal Communications Commission are doing a consultation. They got nearly 24 million responses. Now, some will be robots, some will be Russians, but overall, that is a lot of people
10%
caring
of the population?
about net neutrality. I don't think you would have the same response here.
No, because we have a much more competitive access market. So whether it be on mobile or whether it be on fixed, we have a much more competitive marketplace.
How about this, if we're looking forward, and jump in with any of your own thoughts as well. OK, so if I want to go on one internet service provider, I'm going to get a program that I don't like. I can, let's say in a few years' time, go to another internet service provider by pressing a different button here, or a different button there, or a different button there. So it's all of the internet service providers are in fact bundled together, and I get to choose which different section I use just by pressing that, by buying an overall service. Therefore, I go back to square one.
Well, I think providing that overall service.
Well, perhaps they're forced into doing so.
Yes, that's why I think we may move towards more utility-style regulation, where we actually say there has to be a bare minimum that everybody gets. The UK government's committed to, I don't know, 50 megabytes or gigabytes or whatever it is, and that guaranteed minimum will ensure that the great British population gets access to most things they want.
Like there is an electricity grid.
Indeed.
Where all the electricity goes in and we just pull out what we need.
I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that the OTT providers are investing very heavily in their own
OTT,
networks.
you don't mean over the top?
I do mean
You do? OK.
I mean the Googles, the Facebooks, the Netflix, they're building large networks themselves. Very soon they will have very, very large footprints which can compete fairly convincingly with some of the major telcos.
So watch out for the army coming over the hill.
Netflix already has its content delivery networks within ISPs, so essentially they're caching content, they're getting little bits of their own content, so it's quicker to load to you even if you're on a slow internet connection. That's why you might notice that something like YouTube or something like Netflix tends to run a lot better than, say, some other original website where they've uploaded the video themselves, and that's by design. So they've already, so in a sense, if your concern is about companies using lots of money to get faster connections to you, they're already doing that, and we tend to think that's quite good because it means you get services at the same price a lot faster. Now, I think the big problem with treating the internet like a public utility is that the evidence suggests that it just doesn't work in terms of investment. So the classic example is DSL and cable modems back in the early 2000s. A study by Thomas Hazlitt, who used to be the chief economist at the FCC, found that when they got rid of Title II treatment, the same treatment they've applied to all ISPs for DSL, you saw a massive boost in subscriber numbers, a massive section of people just flooding to DSL because firms started investing a lot more.
I'm sorry, but in Europe, the exact opposite occurred. Government, European Union intervened with a regulation directly applicable on local loop unbundling, which absolutely promoted DSL modem rollout. So regulation can work in both ways. And there's no simple panacea of saying remove it and it'll work, or implement it and it'll go wrong.
There's also that all of those things happened at a very different time, which was the exponential growth of people coming online for the very first time.
All right, so you think he's talking nonsense?
It's incredibly complex picture, and it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint one single cause.
Let me ask this. Is this sort of almost like a sort of a first world problem? I mean, we're worrying about something that perhaps in a few years' time we'll think was insignificant because the whole landscape will have changed. Or does this really affect people's lives rather than just their entertainment?
I think it's not. Sorry, Ian.
Emily, I was looking at you first, then we'll come to Ian.
So, very much not a first world problem. In fact, you know, apart from the United States, some of the most passionate debates that you get around issues of net neutrality, and particularly zero rating or free basics, happens in the developing world. So, for example, the Indian regulators actually banned zero rating, which is sort of free Facebook for Indian markets, because they're like, this is not the internet, and they evoked net neutrality reasons for doing this. And that was, you'd think on one level, if people don't have the internet, surely some internet is better than none. And actually the voices from people in India and a lot of developing markets is, no, we want the same as absolutely everybody else. We don't want to be given a little privatized bit that's good for us and for free. We want to have the full range of information available.
Come to you in just a minute, but you wanted to jump in.
No, I would have said the same thing. This is more of, I think, a third world problem than it is a first world problem. I mean, this is not, as has already been said, in Europe, we're not really worrying about net neutrality. I mean, we have rules in place to stop the most egregious anti-competitive activities, but otherwise, you know, every country is competing to make sure the general population gets as much gigabytes as they can possibly get.
Okay, since they all disagree with you last time, Sam, you can speak now and then we'll come to Mark at the end.
Well, I think the case in India is a good example of net neutrality laws clearly hurting people, because wouldn't it be great if so many people who'd never had access to the internet were able to access, say, Facebook and Wikipedia and Twitter, and a lot of those services in the free basics package, as long as you complied to the standards, which meant it was very, very low bandwidth, you were able to access that. And there's evidence actually to say that a lot of the people who started on free basics ended up buying full internet services once they knew what it was about. So it meant a lot more people were online, which I think is a good thing.
1997, I think it was, or around about then when we started talking about internet connectivity, etc., etc. I mean, how far have we come that 20 years later we're talking about this? I remember once referring to it in the early days, I have to say, as Wi-Fi rather than Wi-Fi, because nobody knew quite how to say it. We have come a long way, haven't we? Is this going to be yesterday's problem in 5 years' time?
No, I don't think so. And coming back to that point about, is it a first world problem or a third world problem, I come back to my point about it being about freedom of speech. And you look in these developing countries, the internet has been a massive positive thing when you look at things like the Arab Spring, when and people being able to communicate on Twitter and negotiate with each other, understand what's going on, and giving people access
or perhaps
to
not
information.
understand at all what is going on, or overburdened by information.
But I don't think
right
it can ever
to
be.
have that
It's the
information.
right to have that information for me, and if you block it, then you go down the path of the Great Firewall of China, where people only have access to what is state sanitized.
Where are we going now?
Where are we going?
I don't mean towards the end of the programme, I mean, where are we going? What's the next big issue?
Well, I think the issues around competition might become less significant going forward, because what you're going to start to see is more mobile providers and 5G compete directly with the big broadband networks. So you're already seeing it in rural areas in America. People are getting their internet via the spectrum via 4G rather than via broadband. So I think that's the next step. And the most important thing there is to make sure as much spectrum as possible is available for that, and that's by auctioning spectrum off, as we've done in the UK, and America slowly caught up with us to do it. But yeah, that's the real next step.
I do know you've got an awful lot more still to say, but we've run out of time on the programme, so we'll save it for when the cameras have been turned off. I want to say thank you very much indeed. It's been fascinating. I have learned quite a lot. We didn't have a competition to see which was the best analogy in the end, but we can talk about that afterwards. Whatever happens, it seems that we are caught in a net of some kind, and will be forever. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.